Have you ever wondered when Stalin started preparing for total war? How was the Red Army able to recover so quickly after losing millions of soldiers? Were you surprised when you were attacked by the Germans in June 1941? Is it true that Stalin was locked up in his house completely dejected during the first week of the German invasion? I advance you since no. Although this story about Stalin's bad reaction to the German invasion has been the one that has been told for so many years, recent research shows that it was not like that at all. In any case, we will leave this topic for the final part of the program. When we talk about total war, which basically means the mobilization of all the resources of a country in the war effort, we all come to mind Goebbels' famous speech of February 1943 announcing this new measure. Although this was the first step that Germany took towards a total mobilization of its industry and manpower for the war, this process was not completed until September 1944. It was exactly at this time that the German government abolished holidays, increased the working hours to about 60 hours a week, rationing was increased, and a little later in October, militias such as the Volkssturm were created. Having seen the German case, let us now see at what moment the Soviet industry was fully activated for total war. By way of introduction, we have to indicate that the Soviet economy began to be governed by a series of 5-year plans, in which every 5 years a goal was set to be achieved. The phrase that Stalin said in 1928 when the first of them was established was the following: "We are 50 or 100 years behind the most advanced countries. We must overcome that gap in 10 years. We either do it, or they will crush us." That said, let's do a little summary of each of these plans. The first of them was established in 1928, and had as its objective the collectivization of the land, and the industrialization of the country. For this task, there was a large foreign investment, and with the help of American engineers who made it possible to open large factories in Russia, with the most advanced technology in terms of production chains. The second 5-year plan was developed during the years 1933 and 1937, and was a continuation and improvement of the actions that had already been carried out in the previous plan. Thus, and at the end of this period, the Soviet Union had one of the largest industrial fabrics in the world, capable of overshadowing any country, as it was going to demonstrate. It was precisely in 1938, in the third 5-year plan, when the Soviet industry was fully prepared and fully focused on the war. The objective of this plan, which was set almost 2 years before the war broke out in Europe, was that by the end of 1942, Soviet industry would be producing annually 50,000 aircraft, 700,000 tons of bombs, 60,000 battle tanks, 120,000 artillery pieces, hundreds of millions of rounds of ammunition, and up to 300,000 tons of chemical weapons. Even so, it should be noted that these production levels that were set were totally exorbitant and could not be reached. In any case, at the end of 1940 the Red Army had 23,300 tanks and 22,000 aircraft. Later during 1941 they would continue to increase this figure, and they would end up facing the 3,500 panzers and 2,500 planes that the German industry at the time could put on the battlefield. However, and although Stalin laid the foundations in 1938 for his entire economy to focus on the production of weapons, the real impulse would not come until 2 years later, specifically on October 23, 1940. It was here that Soviet industry, and all the inhabitants of the Soviet Union, were mobilized to achieve the highest possible level of production. Before analyzing the reasons, let us see some words that Stalin said in 1925 during a talk at the Central Committee of the Communist Party. "The losers of the last war, like Germany, and even the victors, envious of other people's gains, like Italy and Japan, will soon drown in resentment for the conditions that were imposed at Versailles. If a war breaks out, we will not stand by and sit idly by. We will intervene, but we will be the last to do so, because that way we will be able to place the final weight on the scale, the weight that unbalances it." Thus, in this speech Stalin is predicting a future war in Europe, and a final Soviet intervention to reap the fruits of it. Although both Stalin and other European leaders expected something similar to what had happened in World War I to happen, this being a long conflict of attrition, the rapid German campaigns that defeated any enemy in just a few weeks took them by surprise. This led to everything having to speed up, as it was clear that the confrontation against Germany was going to come sooner than expected. Thus, on October 23, 1940, Stalin imposed measures such as the 7-day work week without rest, the mobilization of adolescents between the ages of 14 and 17 to work in industry, or the reduction of food rations. In addition, all the prisoners of war that the Soviet Union had captured to date in Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states were also put to work in the war industry. This was also the moment in which the Soviets verified that the T-26 main battle tank was already completely out of date, and the mass production of the T-34 and KV-1 was ordered as a priority. On the other hand, and with respect to the army, the Soviet leaders set out to reach the figure of up to 4 million soldiers in peacetime, quickly expandable to 12 million more at the time a conflict could break out. In summary, we can say that the Soviets had between 3 and 5 years of advantage over their German enemy, in addition to having American help from the beginning of 1942. This explains the great difference in production that existed between both sides throughout the conflict. Well, having seen this, let's move on to the second part of the program, in which we are going to see if Stalin was surprised or not by the Germans, and what his reaction was during the first days. The version that was told from the 80s, when the Soviet Union entered a process of abandoning communism, was that the German invasion took Stalin completely by surprise, and that the Soviet leader plunged into panic and despair. So much so that by June 25 he began sending peace offers to Hitler. In addition, due to this catastrophic event, the official story stated that Stalin left his command center in Moscow, and that he retired to a house that he had on the outskirts, being totally depressed. He was there for at least 2 weeks while he evaded alcohol, convinced that everything was over for him. According to this story that was kept up for so many years and is still counted as true even today, it was not until 2 weeks later that Stalin finally regained his spirits and decided to lead the Red Army to defend the nation from him. In addition, he also found himself with the strength to give a speech on July 3rd, and address all the Soviet people, whom he encouraged to resist and fight. But, if all this story is false, what interest was there in telling it? In the first place, this version was used by Stalin's enemies after the dictator died in 1953, to show that he was a coward and inept. And it is because characters like Stalin or Beria had made so many purges, once they died they were discredited by the new Soviet leaders. On the other hand, this version reinforces the story in which the Soviet Union is seen as an innocent victim, who suffers an unexpected and totally unjustified German attack. So, and having said this, let's now see what Nikita Khrushchev himself said to his closest comrades during his government at the end of the 50s. No one with an ounce of political good sense should buy the idea that we were duped, and caught on the wrong foot, in a treacherous surprise attack. And the reality is that Stalin has been working tirelessly since he heard about the German attack, having a meeting with Molotov, Beria, Zhukov, and Timoshenko that same morning at 5:45. Throughout that first day, he received up to 24 visits, and he did not stop giving orders to everyone. These orders were addressed to his generals, whom he directed to counterattack, and to those in charge of industrial production, whom he demanded to increase production as much as possible. This frenetic activity continued throughout the first week of the invasion, until after seeing that everything was going from bad to worse, and that the Red Army was being completely destroyed, Stalin showed signs of dejection and discouragement. Thus, it was not until news of the fall of Minsk, and that communications with his army were broken, did Stalin fly into a rage and retreat to his home outside Moscow. As he left his command post, he was heard to say the following: "Lenin left us an enormous legacy, and we, his successors, have flushed it all down the toilet." Finally, and after a few days of retirement in his house at the end of June, Stalin took care of everything again after giving his speech to the nation on July 3rd, and since then he maintained his composure at all times. Finally, It should be noted that the data on casualties during the first 20 days of combat indicate that for every German casualty, the Soviets had 25, counting the prisoners. Well, what is your opinion on the latter that we have commented on Stalin? Have you been surprised at how early the Soviet Union began to prepare for all-out war? If you want to continue delving into this matter, I leave you in the description the entire series that we have with Carlos Caballero Jurado on the Eastern Front. Thank you all so much for being part of this community, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we see each other as always every Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.